Hello and welcome everybody to the Radical Conservatism and Authoritarian Racism workshop. Unfortunately, I have to excuse Natascha Strobel for health reasons, and we wish her a good recovery. Some technical introduction. There is a translation English-German with the headphones here in the room, or also via Zoom if you click on the globe symbol at the bottom of your controls. After our inputs, there will be a short round of reaction of the panel to each other, and then the floor will be open for your comments and questions, and also in the Zoom. Please put your questions then in written form. My colleague Tatiana Moutinho will be the moderator of the Zoom. Thank you very much. My name is Barbara Steiner. I will introduce and moderate this panel. I am the director of Transform Europe, a political scientist and based in Vienna. In Vienna, there is the coordination office of Transform. Transform Europe is a network of 39 European organizations in 23 countries, active in the field of political education and critical scientific analysis. And it is the recognized political foundation of the Party of the European Left, EL. I am happy to welcome and introduce Asli, Aydin and Ugo Paletha to the panel, and I will introduce them in more detail also later. Thank you for being here. Now I want to start with an introduction where I will go into the current situation and the war, and also want to make some points why I believe that current events have a lot of overlaps with our research on the extreme conservative and racist right. Also, but not only, as Heinz Bierbaum, the president of the Party of the European Left, said in the invitation to this conference organized by the EL, Die Linke and Transform Europe, he emphasized the war in Ukraine has created a new situation, altering the political balance in Europe and accelerating its militarization. The far right will feed off the nationalism generated by warmongers on all sides and glorifying militarism, exploiting the refugee crisis and stoking racism and xenophobia. So we condemn the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine. Our solidarity and sympathy goes to all those who live or flee in uncertainty and fear in Ukraine, whose country and life is being destroyed. Our thoughts are with all the victims of this senseless war. We also know that capitalism carries war in itself like a cloud carries the rain. There are no winners in a war except the armament and armament capital and capital. The people who flee, who starve, we mourn the dead and are robbed of their livelihoods are the losers. The effects of war hit those who are struggling in our societies, even in times of peace, particularly hard. The poor, the women, the children, and the migrants. The illegal attack on Ukraine cannot be justified with Russia's security interests, nor with Denasification, which is a stupid argument, but more on that later. We see simply irrational great power aspirations and imperialist nationalism. I like to refer to our manifesto for peace that Transform Europe has launched. We have it in various languages, and you are invited to take it also later. It's also at our website, www.transform-network.net. This peace manifesto tries to give a strategic perspective for peace and concrete next steps. So what to do as a left-winger, not only to say stop the war and down with the arms, Waffen nieder, The armament and the militarization does not prevent war. And it is a completely wrong reaction to war. We should aim instead to make our societies peaceful and arm them against fear, against hopelessness, exclusion, and division, which are, as we also heard before in other panels at this conference, the soil for far-right opinions. We need basic social, economic, ecological security. We need education, health, and culture for all. But there is a threat of social cuts and austerity in the future due to the increased military spending. So each delivery of arms prolongs the war. Actually, there are also in the left some voices to say, well, Ukrainian people have the right to defend themselves. They have the right to get the weapons and to go to war, but a solution for a war will not be found in the military solution. The solution will have to be a political one. So another instrument is sanctions, but they have to hit the right ones. So Thomas Piketty wrote already before the invasion, expropriate the oligarchs and not the people. And an important notion, there are oligarchs not only in Russia, but also in the West. So not only in autocracies, but also in the democracies. The systems are very similar here. So there is protecting the interests of capital in the East and in the West. There is oligarchism, there is tax evasion, there is money laundering. And because this is also happening in the West, the ruling class in the West has no real interest to make transparent where the money lies, where the wealth is parked. Because if there was such a transparency to really expropriate the oligarchs, then it would also hit the Western oligarchs. So it is always depicted as if money laundering or tax evasion or oligarchism is something of the East or of Russia only. This anti-Russian sentiment is very practical racism also for, and very useful racism also for our Western elites. But we also see a very open racism, ideological racism, and practical racism at the borders of the European Union. We see horrendous double standards. Ukrainian citizens are welcomed, and this is good so. The question, to be honest, is for how long, and will they get a life in dignity? Will they be integrated? Or will they be actually again exploited as labor slaves in the near future? But we have a double standard because the refugees that don't hold a Ukrainian passport, those from Afghanistan, from Yemen, from Iraq, from Syria, they are not welcomed. On the opposite, and we heard this also before, they are held in odious and criminal lagers on the Belarusian or the Bosnian border. People are starving, they are freezing, they get beaten, they are pushed back illegally, and they are dying at the border and at the sea. So a comrade and journalist from Poland just told me yesterday that the same border guards on Twitter in Poland, they tweet about 2,000 Ukrainian refugees welcomed. And the same person in the same tweet feed mentions and successfully hindered 70 illegal migrants from entering. So they mean on the one hand, Ukrainian Christian refugees can be welcomed. When they are not holding a Ukrainian passport, it's their duty to hinder them to enter the European Union. So it is necessary to erase these double standards, and it's also necessary to recognize deserters as refugees and to recognize it is a reason for flight if you are not willing to take up arms and kill others. So another point I think we should be aware of, it is not only Putin who is a psychopathic, pathological, psychopathic leader, but it is a system, Putin, that we are talking of. There are people who profit and who benefited from this radical conservatism that we saw established in Russia in the last decade. There is again the proposal of Thomas Piketty to look at the richest Russians who have a wealth of over 10 millions. It's about 20,000 people who profited the most from Putin's regime. They have half of their assets parked in Europe, be it in the capital market, or be it in housing, or rather they have parked their assets and wealth here. So if we would have this transparency register for wealth, we could have a tax on this wealth and freeze the rest of the wealth. This would be a real instrument to put pressure on Putin to end this war. And now to the argument of denazification that was named by Putin as a reason for invading Ukraine. This is of course nonsense, but because if you look at Russia, there are many neo-Nazi structures there in Russia itself. And if you look to Europe or the USA, there are several cases of neo-Nazi groups and right-wing extremist parties who got funded by Russian institutions, be it the United Russia Party, be it the Secret Service, or all other institutions from Russia. So there are concrete support from Russia to neo-Nazi groups in Europe. Admittedly, in Ukraine, it is not easy to be a left-winger, like in Lithuania or Hungary. Communist symbols like the Red Star are forbidden, left-wingers are persecuted and face repression, as does the Communist Party. So there had always been, also been for a long time, the problem of historical revisionism in Ukraine, but also in the European Union. Remember, there were several resolutions by the European Parliament equalizing and equating fascism and communism. So it's not a Ukrainian problem alone. And the extreme right fell out of parliament in the Ukraine, but still there are neo-Nazi groups and even armed militias who are now even stuck with more arms from the West, like the Asimov regiment. So in the end, a left-winger can only demand everything must be done for an immediate ceasefire. The solution will be found at the negotiating table and will sooner or later have to be a diplomatic one. The NATO is not a peacekeeping entity or project, but an instrument for asserting neo-colonial interests. Their dissolution must be our goal as left-wingers, even though it is currently an absolute minority position. It needs instead a European security architecture, including Russia, because Russia is part of Europe, and a European peace conference is needed. So also a nuclear-free weapon zone in Central Europe, and in perspective, demilitarization and disarmament worldwide is needed. It needs also the abolition of the deadly border regime. It needs evacuation and family reunification, admission and integration of the refugees, nonetheless from where they come from. Daniel Obono called this morning our situation that we are in, the historic situation, a situation where we have to make a civilizational choice. So the far right is not fought against only in the street. We have heard that earlier. We must not underestimate the role of the traditional and conservative right in normalizing authoritarianism, racism, and patriarchal exploitation, and also the intertwinement with the interests of the capital. We must not also underestimate the alleged rebellion of the far right, which always shows to be an authoritarian and conservative rebellion. And I am now happy to give the word to Asli Aydin to speak on a country that is also at war in repression against parts of its own population and at war in Syria. It is the NATO member Turkey. I am happy to hear about the situation in Turkey, an example of authoritarian neoliberalism, of racism and radicalized conservatism. Asli is an economist. She carries out her studies in the fields of labor economy and technology and development, and also recently climate change. She is currently at Kadir-Has University. She continues as an academician after being an economics writer in Bir Gün newspaper, one of Turkey's left-wing newspapers. She had also been a researcher at KESK, the Confederation of Public Employees Trade Unions. Asli is also a member of the Left Party, Sol Party in Turkey, and a member of the European Left Executive Board on behalf of the party. Asli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara, for welcoming me and for organizing this session. It is quite important to me to explain the conditions in Turkey, what's going on, and what are we living today. And if you excuse me, I will continue with reading my speech because I write down. If I start to talk naturally, I become very fast and not easy to understand sometimes. For you, I wrote down. Okay. When authoritarian racism and radicalized conservatism are the headlines in our session, my job gets pretty easy. I have personally experienced these practices in Turkey, as you guess, since 2002. But I still want to come to Turkey before starting to talk about Turkey. I want to start from general view. The neoliberal policies which are implemented in the post-1980 world and the 2008 crisis contributed to strength to authoritarian tendencies, and obviously it has led to the gaining ground for far-right fascist, religious, and fascist policies in countries such as Italy, Germany, France, Austria, England, India, and the Philippines, and we can multiply these examples. Extreme right-wing, racist, and anti-immigrant movements gained strength. And these movements also found a certain support in their societies. They were close to ruling power, or they become partners of the ruling power. Talking in general terms, it is becoming more and more common that liberal democracy is in a deadlock in the world. The principle of separation of powers is broken. The independence of the judiciary is eroded. The security forces violently suppressed democratic protests, and the freedom of the press is restricted. Fascism has this common feature. Fascism, in any case, includes nationalist, racist ideology and violent repression against class opponents. And it always chooses a scapegoat. The AKP government came to power in Turkey 20 years ago and has been ruling the country for 20 years. I will try to explain the construction process of fascism in Turkey and the phenomenon we call Islamic fascism, with an example from Turkey in 3 steps. First step is consolidation. There is no doubt that AKP government has received full support from the US and the West since its establishment. Primarily, it was a functional tool. In realizing the US Middle East policies. This relationship was also very useful for the AKP itself in the breaking moments of domestic policies. And during the closure trial of AKP in March 2008, in the economic crisis that is followed, in the 2010 referendum in Turkey and the July 15 coup attempt, the West always stood behind Erdogan. Moreover, while Social Democrats and Greens gave this support in Europe, Democrats were in power in the US, while the AKP gets this support. The political and economic support from the outside made the AKP's hand very comfortable inside, while it successfully emerged from the breaking moments mentioned above. It was able to tell the steps that can be considered as the construction of the Islamist fascist regime as reform. In short, the AKP didn't establish all the steps on the Islamic fascism or any clue about that. They called all that steps they have done as reform. The first step is very important because this presents an example of how authoritarian governments came with the makeup of democracy, with the full supports of the liberals behind them. The second step is the religious surrounding. In the past 20 years, AKP has designed both the state and society with a reactionary approach. One of the most distinctive features of the AKP years was the increasing influence of Islamic cults and their networks on the social base. These structures, which increased their organization over the poor people or the class itself, if we are more general, were critical tools for creating an atmosphere suitable for the social design of this regime. Cults concentrated in the neighborhoods where the influence of leftist politics was broken, played a key role in the working class taking on a character that did not rebel against the living conditions and was grateful and resigned. If I want to open a parenthesis here, in the Islamic motives, to be grateful and to be thankful for which is given to you, it is actually used for the class to suppress them, to become thankful for all the things. For example, they don't protest their wages, they don't want more, they don't want their deserved ones. So it is used, the Islamic motives used to make a pressure on the class. So if you ask, okay, and actually, to make it concrete, the work-related accidents and the deaths that took place during the AKP period were interpreted as God's will, in accordance with the religious climate. Moreover, the cult networks of the AKP were staffed in the public offices. This allowed them to do work in public offices with their supporters, only with the supporters, by the way, to give them the public tenders, in short, to create a rent and supporters network. Importantly, they were staffed in the judiciary, they were staffed in the military, and they took over the media. And they started a serious reaction in the field of education. This is very important. Let me give you a current example. A medical student committed suicide last month. The reason was complete occult pressure. This young man, was a poor student, and apart from the cult dormitories, the state didn't provide him with a shelter. So his only choice was to stay in the cult dormitory, and he ended his life because of the pressure to fulfill the religious obligations. And because of that pressure, he ended his life. He was a very brilliant medical student and was very young. And if you ask where this construction process took us now, it took us the one-man regime. The judiciary, the parliament, the legislature, the police, the media, the army, the entire dominance of the streets are in the hands of one single man. And I would like to say that building such an Islamic regime in Turkey is not easy, because Turkey is not an Islamic country. Yes, we are. The population of the Muslims are in very high, but we are not an Islamic country. So although they gathered all power in their hands on paper, the progressive characteristic of society always appeared as offset. In universities, workplaces, in secular education, and obviously women, who are the victims of this regime, are the most organized and widest part of the social opposition right now. As the voices started to get louder and louder in the streets, in every field, in every room in Turkey, the AKP start to show a harder stick. And this is the third, but not least step. Thousands of people are detained in the country for insulting the president. This is only reason they are accused. And even held in detention for months without any explanation. If we go back to the general, authoritarian governments begin to resort to more repressive and authoritarian methods, and in another sense, to build a fascist process in order to manage the society and increase exploitation. Before it evolves into such a process, polarization and others increase in the society, such as discrimination against women, and LGBTE plus S is getting widespread, and anti-immigrant reactions are on the rise. Apart from Turkey, the Lega Party in Italy, the far-right National Front Party in France, the Freedom Party founded by former SS officers who entered the government by forming a coalition with the center-right in Austria could be examples for that. So how do we offset this process? Let me begin by this. As I said in the beginning, the authoritarian governments, or one man's like Erdogan, like Putin, are not coming with the aim of anti-democratic authoritarian one-man regime. They are coming into the power with the makeup of democracy, the liberal rights, and also with a smile faces. I mean, they get the consent of the people. They not take over the parliament. They don't take over the president's chair. I mean, they to take the people's consent. But at the end, they after this process, after this building, let's say, they actually built a one-man regime. So how do we offset this process at the beginning? Because they are obviously fulfilling the rooms we are left for them. The creation of a democratic front against this process is undoubtedly would be the first step. In this context, important tasks fall on the social opposition and the socialist left. It seems essential for the social opposition to form a minimum program on fundamentalist issues such as democratic rights and freedoms, independence of judiciary, secularism, especially for Turkey, social state, and a fair distribution of income, and form a strong union against this totalitarian and fascist understanding of order. It becomes necessary for labor and professional organizations and trade unions to take part in this democracy front. That's all I want to say in this phase. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Asli, for this input, and we will come back to you later in the discussion and question round. I give now the floor to Ugo Paletha. He's a sociologist, associate professor at Université de Lille, and co-director of the review Contretemps in France, where we are, as we know, in the midst of the electoral campaign for the presidential elections, about which we also heard already, and about the various right-wing candidates in the morning, but also about the social mobilizations and also resistance against repressions, and where we also have the issue of secularization, but in France it is often used as an excuse for racist politics. So Ugo, the floor is yours.
Thanks, and thanks for the invitation to speak in this session and in this very crucial conference, given the growing international influence of the far-right organizations, far-right ideologies, and so on, which unfortunately could be even stimulated by in various ways by the Russian military aggression against Ukraine. As some kind of introduction, I'd like to insist on the fact that what has been at work for several years and quite a lot of years should not be understood, in my opinion, as a simple rebirth of fascism or the revival of the 30s, which would imply more or less than fascism, that fascism would reappear almost unchanged with the same ideological clothes, the same tactics and the same practices, etc. This actually would be too easy for us, because fascism has changed, or we could speak of neo-fascism, that would be my choice. Fascism has muted, it has found new discursive forms, it has learned to make itself more mainstream, to penetrate the common sense of important sections of populations. It has proved to be very adaptive to new material and cultural conditions. So to continue with this some Gramscian language, neo-fascism has learned to be very effective in the war of positions, knowing that the war of movement, let's say like insurrections or even armed insurrections, was not at the agenda right now in most countries, which means concretely that most far-right leaders, ideologues, and organizations perfectly know that street fighting gangs or armed militias are not the best tactics to, for the moment, not the best way to get closer to the political power, and on the contrary should be opposed, usually. It doesn't mean we should conceive neo-fascism as some kind of non-violent or peaceful fascism, which would mean basically nothing. On the contrary, it would be very easy to show that far-right organizations like the Rassemblement National, or used to be a National Front in France, or the Lega in Italy, the AFD in Germany, or I don't know, Fratelli d'Italia, also Vox in Spain. They have links, and sometimes strong links, with different small violent groups, usually nostalgic of classical fascism, we say. They welcome members of these groups, sometimes in very important positions. They supported leaders and organizations that used or justified political violence against opponents, against minorities like Trump or Bolsonaro, for instance, and that their refusal of political violence is only tactical and, as a matter of fact, temporary. But the most important thing is that violence is obviously inherent to the fascist project and would be necessarily unleashed by far-right electoral victories both through an intensification of state violence against minorities, against social movements, against the left, and so on, but also through semi-autonomous initiatives from these small groups I just talked about, which would most probably benefit from such victories, and as a strong impulse for them to act concretely and violently against the groups that are constantly targeted by the far right. But let's go back to the question of the war of positions. Neo-fascism has penetrated the political cultures of a lot of countries, unevenly, I would say. It doesn't mean fascism is everywhere, or that every conservative politician or organization would be somewhat fascist. Doesn't mean that, but it surely means that one great advantage of neo-fascism, at least in comparison with fascism as it used to be like in the 60s or 70s, the great advantage is that it appears less and less as some extreme and violent project against democracy, but as a radical version of the mainstream. This is linked to, and that is the thing I'm going to defend here. This is linked to a double process, a process of mainstreaming the extreme and a process of extremizing the mainstream. And in both cases, it is the product of an interaction between far-right parties and far-right ideologues on one side, and mainstream parties and mainstream ideologues on the other side. And my guess is that both in the interwar period, if we look at it, and today, fascism can only grow and win, especially if it gains some support, direct and indirect, explicit and implicit, from mainstream political players and behind them sections of the capitalist class. By the way, it's interesting in the case of France to see that Marine Le Pen is the perfect example of the strategy of mainstreaming the extreme, and actually Zemmour is really the perfect example of the contrary, like extremizing the mainstream. Zemmour used to be right-wing, conservative right-wing, classical journalist of the Figaro, which is the classical right-wing paper in France, and it got really more and more extreme in the last 15 years. So now he appears like more extreme than Marine Le Pen, for instance. Even in polls, when you ask people, like more people thinks right now that he's more extreme than Marine Le Pen. And the effect that is not usually seen is that it puts Marine Le Pen more in the center of the political spectrum. Like she appears to be more moderate and less extreme, and it's a part of her strategy for 10 years. So let's take the process of mainstreaming the extreme. It relies both on an active strategy used by far-right organizations to reshape their ideology in order to make it much more acceptable according to usual political standards. For instance, Marine Le Pen understood well that the old-style far-right agenda on women, against abortion, against women's rights, reproductive rights, against women's work, etc., all this was an obstacle, not only an electoral obstacle, because it repelled a lot of female voters, which is the case, and actually her strategy helped her to fill the gap, the gender gap that was always that the National Front was suffering before her. Not only because she's a woman, but also because it put the National Front completely outside mainstream politics and outside the common sense of most people. But what she did was not only dropping this kind of reactionary demands against abortion and all that, but adopting a new position which has been called by Sarah Faris femo-nationalism, which led her to racialize sexism, saying, okay, sexism exists structurally, and yes, we should defend women's rights, and I'm the best defender of women's rights, but because I'm struggling against the main enemy, the true enemy of women, immigrants from the global south, and especially Muslims. The question is always how this kind of strategy can work. And it works because this whole idea that immigrants, Muslims, and Islam are specific and are the main threats to women in France has been in the mainstream from some time now, and much before then Marine Le Pen used this femo-nationalist strategy. So the far right only had to take this idea, this mainstream idea, and make it more explicit, more radical, and to say, okay, everyone says that there's a problem, but nobody wants to propose a solution to it. Let's recognize it's an efficient ideological strategy from Marine Le Pen. And all the Islamophobia of the far right works like this. I mean, at least in France, they are not saying something actually qualitatively different from mainstream politics about Islam, about Muslims. Actually, during a TV debate, Macron's Minister of the Interior said to Marine Le Pen that she was too soft on Islam. So all the far-right strategy of mainstreaming their profile can only work with the complicity of mainstream political actors and media. So let's take now the other process, which is maybe more interesting, extremizing the mainstream, which is, well, yeah, maybe more interesting. It's not only that mainstream politics and mainstream media are constantly providing lots of reactionary ideas and that the far-right is strategically taking advantage of this. There are also processes that at some point could be considered as processes of fascisation, or let's say proto-fascist, which operate both at material and ideological levels. The material aspect of these processes is mainly the internal transformation of capitalist states. Some sociologists like Loïc Vacan, for instance, refer to these kind of processes, talking about the fact that we went from social state to penal states, or to be more precise, from a kind of states post World War II, whose legitimacy was coming from the fact that it integrated popular demands under the pressure of massive working class struggles and organizations, and as a consequence succeeded to improve the life conditions more or less of large parts of populations, especially through public services, social security, etc. So we pass from this kind of state to another kind of state, let's say the neoliberal states, whose entire function is to ensure the best conditions for capitalist accumulation, and which has to break constantly and radically with the social concessions that the capitalist classes had to make after the Second World War. And then this state has a structural problem of legitimacy. So the material aspect of the process of extremizing the mainstream is a material one, is what actually Nikos Poulantzas was already calling at the end of the 70s, the rise of authoritarian statism, which expresses itself through the increase of state repression that we saw with the Yellow Vest, for example, movements in France, a repression that we hadn't seen for like 6 decades. I mean, the numbers that Daniel Obono gave this morning were quite striking. So increase of the state repression, criminalization of social movements, including union activities, the militarization of the police, the decline of parliamentary control, the lack of respect for immigrants' rights, etc. So all of this is not something that the far-right did, at least in most countries, and it's not only an effect of the far-right electoral pressure. They're not doing it because the far-right is high in the polls or high in elections. It is a necessary dimension of the capitalist offensive that we usually call neoliberalism, and whose fundamental goal is to release capital from any popular intervention or control, even the slightest, and to break every working class gain. So to do that, the capitalist class needs an authoritarian hardening. But there's obviously also an ideological aspect of this process, which is very important. We're not going simply from a politics of consent to a politics of repression. Neoliberal leaders like Macron or others are trying to build a new hegemony. And they do so because neoliberal politics are in a deep crisis, because they are facing a crisis of hegemony. Even if neoliberalism has pervaded many aspects of how we think, how we act and all things, even if profits are very high for big capitalist players, the problem for them is that less and less people believe in the core elements of neoliberalism. For instance, this idea of trickle-down effects, that if you give to the rich, you would eventually benefit the poor. Most people don't believe that today, or the idea that there are market solutions to everything, especially, for example, to climate change. Okay, less and less people believe in these kind of things. And materially, actually, in economic policies, in the last, for example, in the pandemic, they went far away from neoliberal, classical core elements. So there's a political problem for the ruling classes. Is there a capitalist political alternative to neoliberalism? And this is where the far right enters the scene. And we should look at what people like Trump, Bolsonaro, or Modi in India are doing, or were doing for Trump in their practice of power. They don't break at all with most neoliberal dogmas, especially those around the labor market. but they provide new narratives, new demands, new fantasies, sometimes new words, which are not so new, obviously, but which lead to some kind of a new synthesis between radical nationalism on one side and conservative neoliberalism on the other side. And racism plays a crucial role in this process, especially Islamophobia in Western countries, but also in India. Not only because doing so, the political elite provides some kind of target for popular anger, the Muslims, but also because the whole idea that Muslims would be an internal enemy, the whole idea that immigrants are criminals, rapists, I don't know, thieves, what Trump was saying, and actually what Zemmour is saying explicitly for quite a lot of time, gives legitimacy for the reinforcement of the state especially in its repressive functions. So we wouldn't understand how easy it has been to break with major democratic rights and to justify the increasing state repression in several countries without the central role of racism, even if after that state hardening can apply to almost everyone. And if I take the example of France, I know better than other examples, it's clear that repressive measures that were targeting Muslims at the beginning and which concretely made very difficult the lives of many Muslims have been used since then against social movements. The biggest anti-racist organization in France, the Collective Against Islamophobia in France, has been disbanded by the government last year without any serious motive. A week ago, the government decided to disband 2 pro-Palestinian collectives, again, without any serious motives. Several unions, including the French Historic Student Union, the l'UNEF, have been threatened to be disbanded because they were organizing internal meetings for racialized people. And now the government is speaking about disbanding some anti-fascist collectives. So we see how Islamophobia has been some kind of locomotive or driving force for state authoritarianism, and also I would say feeding every other forms of racism, like anti-Semitism, Romophobia, etc. So just a few words of conclusion. What does it mean concretely and politically for us? It means, from my point of view, that anti-fascism cannot be only about fighting the far right, as was saying more or less Daniel Obono this morning. It is one part of the story, and one important part of the story, because we still have to block any attempt from far-right leaders and ideologues to build militant organizations. And this is a matter of life and death for minorities, for the left, and for social movements, as we saw in Greece when Golden Dawn began to grow like more than 10 years ago, if I'm not wrong. But an anti-fascism that will only be a street-level fight against fascist thugs or defense of democracy against the far-right threat would be dramatically insufficient to face the deep neo-fascist dynamics. So anti-fascism has to link organically its own agenda to actual struggles against the authoritarian policies, against the racist policies of the ruling class, especially when it radicalizes, as we experience currently in many countries. Otherwise, it's very unlikely that anti-fascism will be able to attract, let's say, the most oppressed and exploited sections of the working classes, and to become the mass movements we need right now. So I would finish quoting and turning a quote from Horkheimer, who was saying, like, if you don't want to speak about capitalism, you should be silent about fascism. But right now we could say that. Actually, it would be true, I would say. But I would expand that. I mean, if you don't want to speak about state racism, especially in France, if you don't want to speak about Islamophobia, you should be silent about fascism, because you won't understand anything about the current dynamics. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ugo. Asli, do you have an immediate reaction or comment or question? Yes?
Maybe later.
Okay.
Actually, I had a question about, you didn't speak about the Kurdish, you say Kurdish in English? Kurdish question and the Kurdish dimension of authoritarian, brutal and repressive policies in Turkey, and that because my idea was that Erdogan radicalized the repressive policies against the Kurdish people, but that it existed before, and that was a dimension of even secular nationalism in Turkey. But maybe I got it wrong. I mean, it's my own reflection about the dialectics between mainstream politics and fascist politics, that there are some discontinuities, but also some hidden continuities between like mainstream forms of politics and fascism. And fascism appears like in the light for liberal people, like liberal parties or central parties. They say like fascism is outside the spectrum, and actually it's not so outside. I mean, at some point, yes, but in many questions, they just radicalizes what was already in the center of the political landscape. Not for everything, but on some dimensions. I don't know.
Yes. Actually, you're right. The Kurdish question has been very functional issue for the right governments in Turkey, because, for example, Erdogan came into the power with a promise to solve this question. And in the first time of their ruling period, they built some the peacemaker commissions, or they try to make alive the dialogues between the Kurdish society and at the political basis. But actually the breaking point in the relationship between Erdogan and the Kurdish, let's say the Kurdish political parties, the popular one is HDP, is actually at the elections after the Gezi resistance. The HDP put aside their its nationalist, Kurdish nationalist character, and started to become the popular party, the one of the popular opposition party. And everyone in the left, because you know we have the main opposition party, and it has very problems in terms of leftists, and they are social democrats at the end. And but in Turkey, they got 30% of votes, so they are big. And what option for us to vote for? It is very limited. So the Kurdish, the HDP became very good candidate for taking votes of the left sides, the progressive sides. And Selahattin Demirtas was very successful at that period, and get not only the Kurdish people's vote. He took the very wide range of leftist votes. And after that, Selahattin Demirtas was taken to the prison, and the Kurdish political movement again was radicalized, as you said, and now nothing continues. I mean, we don't hear exactly big movements from the Kurdish party, and they are trying to take a role in the parliament, but actually in Turkey there is no parliament right now. There is one man. They don't have a right to make any change in the legislation or the daily decisions. Only one man decides what will be happen in the Turkey. So yes, now their relationships are ended, let's say, for now, and it is more likely that the Kurdish party, the Kurdish movement, from the aspect of the whole population, is much more radicalized than before.
I would have a question going in the quite same direction, also to you, Asli, and then I would like to ask you also to give your comments or ask your questions, and also, of course, in the Zoom. Asli, the super high inflation and economic crisis in Turkey. Does it affect Erdogan's power? Is his power shrinking? Is his polls going down? And is there some chance for snap elections? And what would they be looking like then?
Thank you, Barbara, for asking this question, because I am an economist, I would like to speak very long in this issue, but I won't for sure. Yes, exactly. This is again one-man issue, because for example, we have now 50% inflation rate annually. It is very high, and we had, for example, 2 years ago, 7% annually. It goes up from 7% to 50%. Why? Because Turkey is a economically dependent country because of Erdogan's policies. We now, actually, we were a farm country. We can feed ourselves independently in the past, but now we mostly export most of the goods outside. Why? Because the farms were destroyed because they built hotels or the complex sites instead of forests, instead of in the farm fields. So that's why we cannot feed ourselves. We cannot enough for ourselves in not only the agriculture, but also industry and other sectors. That's why we are a dependent country. We need the hot money, actually money flows from outside to make our economy balanced. And we need for that, unfortunately for that, because as a leftist economist, I am totally against for this money dependent, the financial dependency situation. But this is the reality, and in this reality, in this actually framework, the central bank has to adjust its interests, and because of that, actually, in order to do that, let's say, the central banks should be independent from the political authorities. But in Turkey, because there is a one-man regime and one man decides all the areas, all the fields in the country, Erdogan wants the president of the central banks to decrease the interest rates. This is actually walking against the wind situation. This is nothing economically, you cannot describe this economically or rationally. It's not rational to decrease the interest rates, because, for example, the conditions, the global conditions, wherever the US Fed is in the process of increasing the interest rates, where the short-term financial money is get limited, and so on. The countries like Turkey, like Brazil, should increase their interest rates. That's why we have high level of inflation. That's why we have, for example, twice a day price increase in oil. And it is like a joke when if I tell the prices in Turkey right now, because, for example, the euro, the currency is, for example, 1 euro is 16 Turkish liras. 2 years ago, it was 7 or 8, like that. It is a huge increase, and it is a huge, actually, Turkey became very poor. The Turkey, people of Turkey. The wages were not adjusted to that increase, the inflation. So we have high rate of unemployment, high rate of prices, but the wage levels are so less compared to this increase. That's why it is a result of one-man regime economically and socially, I can say.
Thank you very much, Asli. Are there questions in the room for one of our speakers? Please, I think you need to take the microphone for the translation. And then I also have a question in the Zoom.
Okay. I wanted to ask Asli, I wanted to thank you of how you presented this, explained to me. I'm coming from Greece. This Islamic fascism that Erdogan established. And speaking of war, 1 year ago, we almost had a warlike incident in the border of Greece and Turkey in the river of Evros, where the migrants and the refugees were weaponized by both countries. They were driven by Turkey on the fence that is built by Greece illegally, but it exists, and they were forced to cross this fence, and they were subjected. The Greek police and the Greek army was throwing tear gas to them, and the Turkish police or army, I don't know, were doing the same. So I wanted to ask whether this fascism, this Islamic fascism, has strong nationalistic characteristics, and also a kind of imperialistic one, if we can say, as regards the Kurds, as regards the role of Turkey in Syria, in the Syria conflicts, but also up to the north. How I would also like to ask how the Turkish left society understands this kind of weaponization of the refugees and the immigrants. Thank you.
Yes, actually, so sorry.
We have then a second question also to you, but should we put it now? No, answer first.
Yes, especially Syrian refugees are a big problem in Turkey, because it was Erdogan's plan to make these Syrian refugees as a bargaining power to the West and outside, especially West, and it didn't work. Erdogan's plan didn't work, and we have very high level of refugees in Turkey right now. Actually, the left's position about the refugees are we should welcome refugees because they are the victims of war, which Turkey is a part. And if Turkey didn't take any role anyway, they should be welcomed because they have no places to go. But Erdogan accepted the refugees as a weapon, as you said, against the West, and he actually threatened the European Union with these refugees, and it didn't work again. And the left points about them, the Syrian people haven't been integrated to the society. They left alone. They left actually without any shelters, without any educational opportunities, or even health. They are out of health system still. And for especially during the COVID pandemic, we don't know what percent of refugees or get this COVID first, and reflected to the that levels, that rates, that data, let's say. So they are not monitored by the authorities, and they are left alone. They are living in the streets. They are actually open to the nationalist reactions on the streets, because what is happening in Turkey right now, for example, as I said, the unemployment rate is very high, and wages, actually, because of inflation, is very high. The minimum amount of wage is actually higher than before, and this triggers small offices, small enterprises, let's say, choose Syrians to employ instead of Turks. Why? Because if you employ Turks, you have to pay minimum wage rate, and the taxes are high. That's why they employ the Syrians at a very low level of wages and very poor conditions. And they are, for living, they have to work very bad conditions, especially women and children. Children are, some of the women and children, a considerable number of women and children are sold. That kind of crimes, the humanity crimes, are actually happening in Turkey still. So it is a big problem, and it is left alone, I can say. But in the time when they are functional, they become functional for the relationships between European Union and Erdogan, maybe they start to see this problem, but now they left this problem out of the agenda.
Thank you, Asli. I have now a question to Ugo. Or I start with a comment that my colleague Heidi Ambrosch put in the Zoom. The political narrative remains in the patriarchal discourse. Women are thought to remain passive. You mentioned the femo-nationalism strategy of Marine Le Pen. How is the women's movement reacting in France, and what are the strategies? And also, you mentioned who wants to speak about fascism shall not remain silent about Islamophobia. So what are left-wing anti-fascist feminist struggles and movements doing about this?
Actually, I would say there are some divisions in the feminist movement in France, and especially it's a really schematical, it's binary, but there is like a generational cleavage on the feminist movement, especially on that question, a split. I mean, for many young feminists, I would say the question of for example, having like demonstrations with women wearing hijab is not a problem. I mean, and which is not the case, and which was not the case like 15 years ago, like almost 20 years ago. On the 8th of March, I remember things in, I think it's 2004, and like really tensions and confrontations between different collectives for equality, and actually feminist collective who didn't want women wearing hijab to enter the demonstration, which was like completely crazy. Anyway, but so and you still have figures or ancient feminist figures like Elisabeth Badinter, who wrote quite a lot of books some interesting, by the way, but who is, for example, said like Marine Le Pen, said good things about Marine Le Pen, like as a defender of secularism and all that. So which is one of the problem we have is the whole debate of secularism, like Islam and Muslims are threatening the Republic because they're threatening the secularism and all that, and saying like behind every hijab there's a Islamist plot. And it's really the idea. I mean, a plot against the Republic and all that. So we are struggling with this kind of ideas that has been spreading in the French debate, media, and political spectrum for like 20 years, more or less, or even almost like 40 years actually. So, but especially in the last 20 years. So the feminist movement, I would say I'm pretty optimistic actually about the new tendencies in the feminist movement right now, which is way better than it used to be like 15 years ago, and trying to build solidarities with, for example, there's a struggle right now. This is crazy. This is France. So some parliamentarians want to ban to prevent girls who wear a hijab to participate to sports competitions because they wear hijab. So there's a struggle against this law that they're trying to pass on the parliament. And from what I saw, I think the feminist movement is globally, I mean, the feminist collectives, especially young feminists, they're trying to build some solidarities with this struggle, which is pretty new in comparison with what was happening 20 years ago. And what was the second question? About the anti-fascist movement. Yeah, it changed. The question was pretty difficult about Islamophobia, also in the anti-fascist movement like 20 years ago. Right now, I would say one of the main anti-fascist collective is really active on these questions. Especially on the questions of, I was talking about that, the struggle against this law for sports competition and all that, L'Action Antifasciste Paris Banlieue. And so now the understanding that Islamophobia is central both in mainstream politics and in fascist politics, and central to understand the fascist dynamics in France, or neo-fascist dynamics, is this understanding is being quite spread it's quite more and more common in the left and in the anti-fascist movement. So I'm more optimistic right now than I used to be about this, because, for example, we had the biggest demonstration we ever had against Islamophobia like 3 years ago, with more or less all the left supporting like Muslims because there was an attack against a mosque in the south of France, and after this demonstration, and it was the first time there was such a big demonstration, massive demonstration, and the first time that the left, in every sections of the left, more or less, the unions, the political parties, were supporting the Muslims in that context. So actually there was a backlash after that. So the disbanding, for example, of anti-Islamophobia collectives, anti-racist collectives, but the tendency in the French society, the tendency in the French society are more contradictory than it used to be like 15 years ago, when every law was passing really easily. So now it's less easy. There are more reactions against Islamophobia than definitely that it used to be. And the anti-fascist collectives and movements, which are small, but are doing their part in I would say, in that struggle. They should be doing more, I would say, but they're doing more work on that than they used to be like 10 or 15 years ago. So I don't know if I'm answering the question.
Yes.
So it's maybe too optimistic, I don't know, because the problem is that every attempt from Muslims in the French society to defend themselves against Islamophobic acts, violences, discriminations, like the CCIF, the Collective Against Islamophobia, every attempt, organized attempt, is being repressed right now. So this is the pessimistic part of the story. So we will see what's going to happen. We have like the far right, like 30% right now. And the other part of the story with demo is radicalizing something that was present before and outside of him, but is really developing, and it's not the only one, but a conspiracy Islamophobic theory. Like there is a plot, and I have the solution, and the solution is putting out the Muslims. And actually, he talks about deportation in an interview in Italy like a few years ago. but it's really like Zemmour is making really explicit what was before implicit in many speeches in the media and political spectrum. So but he's making it more acceptable to say this kind of thing. So it's not nothing. I mean, what he's doing is not like creating something new, but what he's doing is it will have some effects. And actually, it could even have some effects that we don't see now, because he's Jewish, and also it could feed some kind of anti-Semitism, because I hear the thing that is for some people it could I mean be some. I mean, he's rejected by most Jewish people, because also he's trying to rehabilitate the Vichy, and so. But for some people, he could the idea that the Jewish are attacking us, or because Zemmour is Jewish. So it also fits some wave of anti-Semitism. I mean, the fact that he's attacking so explicitly and so brutally the Islam and Muslims in the French society. We will see in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Ugo. It's very interesting for me, the solidarity with the women in France who defend their right to wear a hijab is the same solidarity with the women in Turkey who defend their right not to wear a hijab. So but we are talking about, it's the same necessary solidarity there. I give now the floor to Connie Hildebrand from Transform Europe, the co-president.
Also, at first, many thanks for your contribution. I'm really impressed. And for me, is it fascinating to hear, on one hand, the Islamization, on the other hand, the Islamophobia. And both connected to see, also, is, of course, it's a question to you. Is it connected? Of course, it is connected, but what is the role behind is my question, with the question of religion. Also, especially in France, we know we have a strong, in the background, a strong Catholic society in the past. But from the German point, today, we speak more, when we speak about our religious background in the German society, we are speaking about secularization, the process of secularization. And concerning this, is it for me to hear from you, in which way was it possible in the time of secularization to give the Islamization such kind of power? Also, what was possible in the society, and maybe what was missing, in which, also, in which role came, or was it possible to bring the Islamic organizations in this political role? That was my first. The second question is, I really impressed about your description, Ugo, about the adaptation, the capability of adaptation and modernization of the far right. And the question is behind, also, what is in which way, is it a kind of a working division between Zemmour and Le Pen? Could you say Zemmour is a kind of modernized, or on the high level, a kind of re-traditional ways? And Le Pen is trying to bring the right-wing ideology in the mainstream, and is more successful in this way. My question is concerning all this development. What is left in this difficult conflicts? And Asli, for you, also my last question is, what is with the democratic left? Also, exists some democratic left in the parliament, or outside, only outside from the parliament? What capabilities they have?
Before you answer the question, I would like to give also Tatiana the floor for a question from Zoom, because in 7 minutes we have to close, so it will be, your answers will be your closing words.
Okay, so thank you. There is a question directed to Asli from Ronya, I think, Gernstein, and who is asking in how far does Boskartlar, the Grey Wolves, the far right Boskartlar. Okay, how far do they play a role in increasing authoritarianism of Erdogan and AKP? What is their relation? And because it is especially a problem regarding their increasing presence in Germany, Austria, and France, but also regarding to an approach to link the international anti-fascist fight for this organization. Thank you.
Okay, if you want, let me be more short to combine them because they are very connected to each other. Let's start with the Islamization. You are very right, because if they asked me 20 years ago that the Turkey will become like this, I said it is a very bad joke, because it actually happened. The Islamization didn't come actually in a one day. As I said in the beginning, it is a construction process. They start with the neighbors. Before, Turkey was ruled by a coalition government, which I can describe as the elitist, lost the connection with the people in the society. And it was, again, right coalition, right-wing coalition. And we had a huge economic crisis in 2001. And after the 2001, actually the IMF policies were implemented in Turkey. And the AKP came into power with a great support of the liberals in Turkey. Not actually as expected, the nationalist people. It get the support actually from the liberal side, and of course the society. But the AKP's success was actually to get the votes of the working class, because working class in Turkey are left alone by the left parties. It was like that in reality, because the left parties are not very strong in Turkey, not very popular, and not actually white in society. So they worked, AKP worked in the inside the working class. And actually the women especially played a great role in mobilizing these low wage levels in Turkey. And that's how they became the power. And since that period, they transformed the educational system. Now, from very small ages to university, children are receiving religious motives in education. It is very important, and the parents have no other choices apart from the colleges, the private colleges. So actually, it is a very good example, because the Islamization and privatization are worked simultaneously in Turkey. For example, AKP transformed the education in an Islamic way, and at the same time they let the private colleges can manipulate their agenda in a secular way. So in reality, for the poor people, AKP showed the religious education, but for people who are, I can describe as the middle wage and the high wage groups, they sent their children to private college. And actually, transformation in society has been a long process, but the cult networks are played a great role on that, because, for example, they found a job for unemployed people. They found shelters for students. They actually protect women from violence at their Islamic houses. So actually they provide which social state should provide at the first. So they actually become ruling power in Turkey and transform the society. But in Turkey right now, democratic left, you asked. In Turkey, I can describe the opposition. We have a, yes, we have an opposition front in Turkey. And the Turkish society is polarized as AKP supporters and the others. I mean, not the minority, I mean by the others, the mass population who are against AKP. And it is, in other words, it is a polarization of secularism and Islamic, let's say, the political Islamic society, because Islamization or Turkey, the 90% of the population is Muslim, but the secularism is very important for Turkey because of that. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, because of that, he insisted in secularism in Turkey because it is very important, because of the characteristics of society. That's why it is very sentimental point that the political Islam is the characterization of AKP, because they use the Islamic motives, Islamization, as a politics. And the right coalition, or the AKP and the right coalition, they are at the far right, I can define them. As actually, we can divide the AKP period by 3. The more liberal period, it is at the beginning. The being a state period, because we don't define AKP as a government. They actually became a state. Because they took all the power, legislation, military, police, and media, and all the actual states part. They collected under the one man's power. That's why they became a state and becoming a state period. And the last period is actually getting weaker period, let's say, because AKP has lost very important power, important amount of votes in this stage. So AKP needs a coalition, and the far right is the best suitable option for him. And as I said in the beginning, Erdogan supported, not supported, but came up with a new solution with the Kurdish question. But after becoming the ruling power, he lost his promises, or he lost that vision. And that's why it made him easier to make a coalition with the far right. So yes, the far right is the best option for Erdogan, and he used this. And now, actually, I have to say that he lost actually economic power already. He lost the Middle East strategy. It is a very big fail for Erdogan. And he actually lost the support of the woman. I mean, the AKP supporter woman. because now they are included in the women opposition in Turkey. Why? Because for example, violence against women is very high in the AKP's period, and the children lost their hope for future. We lost our generation's hope. So the women actually left AKP, and actually he lost his power in very most important areas. That's why he needed a coalition, and a far right was very best option for him in this case. Okay.
Thank you very much, Asli, and let's hope that the democratic opposition will win the next election. Ugo, your closing words, please, and your answers to the question.
Erdogan has had quite an influence on not only on Turkish immigrants or sons of immigrants in France, but also like people with North African origins and Muslim people. And the main explanation for me is like the Islamophobia in France, because Erdogan has played this tactical thing, like saying denouncing Islamophobia. Yeah, of course, and also on Palestine. So really opportunistically, he played that card, and so he has quite an influence, actually, a political influence on not everyone, obviously, but some sections of the people. On Zemmour versus Le Pen, I would say it's more like a tactical divergence. I mean, and linked to the position they have in the political landscape. Le Pen has a stable, steady far-right electorate and doesn't move. So she's for like 20% on the polls, and she doesn't move. And so the game for her is like winning, expanding her electorate to the right-wing electorate. So she has to have a more moderate discourse. And I just saw like a 30 minutes on the breakfast this morning interview of Marine Le Pen. What a joy, actually, and she's really effective on that. And really on every question. For example, she was talking about endometriosis, you know, the pathology, women pathology, and she for a far-right candidate, it was like a bit crazy. I mean, no far-right candidates would have talked like this like 20 years ago, having like a proposition of reforms on endometriosis, and that was like, wow. So it changed. So that was I was saying, like fascism has changed and found different and new ways to attract new voters and all that. So and Zemmour, it's different. He's from the right wing, and he has to have a radical. And he had to have like a radical stances, especially on many questions, on every question, to take the electorate of Marine Le Pen, who was not satisfied by this moderate turn of Marine Le Pen. So it's more like tactical divergence. For example, like Zemmour is saying Islam is a problem for Republic, Islam is a problem and for the nation. And Marine Le Pen, she's saying like Islamism is the problem for the Republic. So it appears more moderate. But when you ask what she put under the name of Islamism, she put, for example, women who wear hijab. So more or less it's the same. They don't use the same word, but they target exactly the same people. It's just like Zemmour is trying to be more explicit on saying more radical, like appearing more radical, like it's not the problem of Islamism, it's the problem of Islam, it's the problem of Muslims. So and so we have to deal with this problem. So I am the only one who say the truth about the solution we need, and so but it's tactical differences. Actually, the project is more or less the same. And what about the left in that process? The problem of the left in France is, I would say, not different from other countries on this kind of matter. It's like how you articulate like universal demands that concerns more the largest sections of the population, the working class, even a lot of people from the middle classes, let's say, and to specific demands of oppressed groups, and how you build a coherent project and all that. Actually, the only one, and it's also why I'm a bit more optimistic right now, Mélenchon has changed a lot on many questions, especially Islamophobia the situation of Muslims in France. And actually, this is why when you ask a lot of Muslims right now in France about what they're going to vote for, they say, yeah, I'm going to vote for Mélenchon. A lot of them saying, I'm going to vote for Mélenchon because he's defending Muslims. And actually, yeah, in many meetings and many TV interviews, he said many things about the situation of Muslims in France, which would have been extremely surprising like 10 years ago in Mélenchon speeches. And he has the most coherent vision about the present and the future. So it appears like having like a project, not only like a revendication, a feminist revendication, an interesting. So it has like a project. So this is the problem of the left. Like we are more we are too reactive. We don't. For a lot of time we didn't propose like a real alternative project, a socialist project. I would say but integrating even specific questions, specific operations and all that into a general framework. So this is the challenge for the coming years in France, and I would say in a lot of countries. Yeah, that would be my position.
Thank you very much to both of my speakers. Thank you all for participating. Thanks to the interpreters and thanks to the technician and the organizers. Thank you all.